Well, hello everybody, and here we are at midterm, and it's time to take a look to see what's going to be on the exam. I can't believe it. Really, I cannot believe that we're at midterm already. I don't know what happened to the time. I guess it might be my age. I'm just too old, and time goes by rapidly when you're my age. But I had to stop and double take and actually look and make sure that we were at midterm. Well, we are. So let's take a look, see what's going to happen on the midterm exam. Okay, what do we have? Okay, as I stated way back when, our midterm is 1 week only. It starts Thursday in the testing lab, and it'll run through November 5th. So you have 1 week to get it done, and I did not check the hours. I just didn't have time. But do check and see if they are operating on Saturdays. That's always a good time to do it. You can just about drop in at any time. And so anyway, you have 1 week to do it, beginning on Thursday. That is in the Instructional Testing Services Office Center, whatever you want to call it. That's their new name. It is in the Center Building at 311 Center Building. That's where you will take the exam. It is a computer exam. It's an objective exam. There will be 50 questions. And I'll talk about those in a little bit, but you don't have to worry about writing anything. There's no essay exam or no short answer kind of a thing. It is all done on the computer. The good news is that you are allowed one 3x5 note card. So make sure and put down the things, as I mentioned way back when, the things that you don't know or that you struggle with or you're just a little bit confused about. Put those things on your card for reference. And there is a study guide to this, and it is now available on Moodle. At least I hope it is. I did what I was supposed to do, and I think it's on Moodle, or at least available. I know it's on there. And you can download that and take a look at what it says on there and what you should know in order to pass the midterm. I just want to remind you that you are responsible for your exam and that it is your responsibility to make the exam date and time. That is their time. And oops, I forgot to change that. They do have a different, forget that one. You have it on the syllabus. You have their new website address. So ignore that one that's on the screen, but it is on the syllabus. So I got to make a change on that one. There will be no makeup examination, so get in there on time. And as I remind you, you have 1 week to do it, so that's plenty of time. So what will be on the exam? We are going to cover everything from the classic Hollywood style, and that's what we started with the first week, through this week, which is the romantic comedy. So specifically, let's look at what will be on the exam. First thing is you should have a very good understanding of the American movie industry. And that understanding involves those three things right there: the production, the distribution, and the exhibition of movies. Okay, and secondly, the industry's use of genre to minimize financial risk. So that's essentially what we're talking about with regard to the American cinema. At this stage in film history, what we have is the American movie industry controls the production of films, the distribution of films, and the exhibition. In other words, they produce the films, they distribute the films to theaters through their own corporations, subsidiary distributors, to theaters that they own. And the second thing is they discovered early on that genre, which we'll talk about later, but that type of film is something that they could rely on for making profit, reducing financial risk. Okay, so let us now go back and take a look at the history of the motion picture. Understand the early projection technology and understand the meaning of persistence of vision. That's the psychological term that is used for the moving pictures. If you'll recall that you have a strip of film that runs through that camera and takes individual still pictures of images, and when they run through the projector, as in response to that, as it runs through the projector, it creates the illusion of movement. In the early silent era, that was roughly anywhere from 12 frames per second to about 18 frames per second. It didn't matter too much. You got pretty much the same kind of moving picture, the same kind of speed. But it settled after sound came into movies in the late 20s, and especially it was standardized in the 30s when we shot film at 24 frames per second. And the only reason they chose 24 was because of the fidelity with sound. Understand the key innovations and the individuals associated with it. In other words, our beginnings with the kinetoscope, the inventions of Edison and Dixon, the Nickelodeon era, which is, of course, a theater. You put your nickel in, you get to see a movie. The MPPC, which is the Motion Picture Patents Company, which was owned by Edison to control movies. He controlled, if you wanted to make a movie, you had to get a camera from Edison. And then the development of the movie palace. These opulent, beautiful theaters that reflected the magic of the movies. Okay, also have a good understanding of narrative style, which is the ways in which cinematic stories are told. In our film series, and it was complemented by comments in the book, they identified 5 significant things about film narrative. The first one they described as equilibrium and disruption. What is that? It is this, according to our own book. An initial state of affairs is introduced after which something occurs to disturb this equilibrium. So in other words, the equilibrium is simply things are normal. What you have is when a movie opens, for the most part, you have everything is what you'd call normal. There are no problems, nothing. It just seems to be existence. But then something happens to disturb the equilibrium, which is the disruption. Subsequent events attempt to restore the original status quo, but this is repeatedly frustrated, and order is recovered only at the end of the film. So that's a basic narrative. So again, simply put, what you have is everything is normal. Something happens to disrupt that normality. Something happens to disrupt it, which could be anything. In most cases, it's going to be a villain enters the picture somehow who does something to upset that normalcy, okay? And then what you have is efforts to restore the status quo, to bring things back to normal. But these efforts are always thwarted. They're thwarted by all the machinations of the evil villains. But the hero will eventually succeed, and he brings normalcy back. He brings everything back to equilibrium. So that's that part of it. Associated with that is problem solving. What is that? Over the course of the narrative, characters struggle to achieve their goals or solve their problems. Okay? That's pretty simple. What are the problems? They can be anything at all. They can be subtle types of things. They can be character faults. They can be issues between people or problems between people. Or they can be horrible things that come out of nowhere, like monsters from outer space that land and try to take over the world. It can be anything like that the character has to solve. It has to be a problem that he has to solve or she has to solve. As it also notes there, it is to achieve a goal as well, because as we'll talk about that later under the journey, but in many cases there is also this sense that I have to achieve some kind of goal, not just solve a problem, but achieve a goal. They overcome those who stand in their way, triumph over adverse circumstances, and or transcend their own limitations. Most character studies have that latter part. They transcend their own limitations, that they encounter themselves and they must struggle within themselves to overcome something. Okay, then the next thing that they talk about are the interesting points here of temporal and spatial limits. What are they? According to our book and according to the film series, a temporal dimension is this: a specific deadline has to be met or a certain task has to be completed by a definite time. Okay, we don't see too much of this. It's usually implied in most Hollywood films. However, some films do give us that you have a certain amount of time to reach your goal. And so we go along with our heroes within that time frame to reach that goal. One of those, the most obvious one, that was a film made in the 40s, in 49, I believe, called DOA, which Dead on Arrival, in which the hero himself has been poisoned and he has 24 hours to live. And his task is to find out the guy that has essentially killed him. And they tried to do this within 24 hours. Of course, it's not going to happen that way because we're not going to spend 24 hours in a theater. On television, I always laugh at these because in the early days of television, live television, they often did a similar kind of film, and they would actually say that we have to get this job done within 24 minutes. Which was pretty much the time that you have for an early television show. And they would actually have a clock, like a bug on the TV screen, a clock that was counting down the time. And that, of course, creates the suspense. The second thing is a spatial dimension. Okay, characters moving toward precise destinations or geographical goals. Okay, these are obviously the films of some kind of a journey, in which you have to, in many cases, it's to cross a geographical space. So as you can see, it's time and space is essentially what they're talking about here. Okay, now let us get to the journey. They have an interesting take on this with regard to the journey. They talk about the narrative, the journey within the narrative, which is easy to understand. Characters move not only spatially, but they realize other non-spatial goals as well, making deadlines, solving mysteries, falling in love, discovering new worlds, and coming to terms with themselves and or their fellow travelers. So it always begins with the journey. It is the journey of some kind of a character that moves from this point to this point. And as it's stated right there, it could be any number of things, but it's their journey. So and we watch that as that is occurring. That becomes part of the pleasure that we get out of watching films. But our film series also talked about the audience's journey. And they bring up the kind of a symbolic notion, the kind of idea about us going to the movies, in the sense that we literally have to journey to a theater to see that event, which is, it might be hard to see, it might be hard to take, but it is a qualitative difference between sitting in your living room and having a movie come to you versus you getting out of your living room and going to see the movie. So anyway, it's that part. It is also, as they stated, is what we see on the screen is what we are doing at that very moment. We are looking for goals, we are participating in deadlines, and we are undertaking journeys as well. In other words, what that means is that we are living the journey vicariously with that figure that we see, the heroic figure that we see on the screen. We become part of that. And, you know, in a simple form, It's like, I mean, everybody's waiting for the big Star Wars movie that's coming, Everybody can hardly wait. But you go all the way back to the very first Star Wars film and watching the audience. I can remember being in a huge auditorium. I decided to see it a second time, so I drove into one that had all the fancy sound and all of that kind of stuff, the surround thing. You hear the spaceships behind you that goes overhead. And I got a real kick out of watching the audience, especially the young kids, because I even thought about this. They are participating vicariously in that thrill because they would literally go forward in their seats, during the attack on the Death Star. And they would be in there with those pilots, going into that trench and doing all that fancy special effects work. So in a way, that's what we're talking about here with regard to that journey in which we are participating with those characters. Okay, and the last thing is they made a distinction here between the old-fashioned dramatic unities expressed by Aristotle and segmentation. Segmentation is a process of structural analysis that breaks the film down into its basic narrative units. Okay, those people involved in film production understand this because when you are involved in a film, you are actually breaking things down and shooting bits and pieces of the film in order to put it together to create a whole. And that's essentially what we're talking about here. We can break that down. We can look at a film and break it down according to its scenes, the shots, scenes, sequences, and so forth. And we can begin to talk about each of these things and how they work together to create that whole. In this regard, the dramatic unities, as expressed by Aristotle, which are action, time, and space, what this means is that most films violate the traditional unities and lend themselves to this segmentation. They're not trying for this seamless unity. Instead, the effect is pretty much that. But what we see with the film is a construction, again, from shots, scenes, and sequences that form an entire narrative. Okay, so that's that part of it. Then we move over to the film techniques and relationships to the narrative. So you should have an understanding of all of those things that you see right there on the screen. You have to understand what mise en scène is. And mise en scène is very simple. It is what you see on the screen. This is how you can talk about a film, and all you do is you see what's within that frame. That is it. That is the mise en scène. There is nothing beyond that frame. So everything that is within that frame has meaning to it, and you can talk about that. You have some filmmakers who like to shoot through junk. Okay, I think of Joseph von Sternberg, who's one of the people who likes to put all kinds of stuff in the foreground. We're shooting through. He creates depth that way. I also think of another director, a minor league director named Roy William Neal, who does the same thing, except he likes to tilt his camera a bit. That's all within the frame. You don't have to worry about what's outside the frame. Okay, you have to, or at least have a good understanding of camera movement techniques in the sense of, if you move laterally, if you're moving with the figure, from side to side like that, what you have is there's various names for it, but it's a dolly shot. If it's a car, if it's a laterally moving kind of thing, they often call it traveling shot when you have a long sequence like that. But there's various names for it, but they all mean that pretty much the same thing. And you can also move on the z-axis. That is, you move towards the object. And when you do that, when you're moving on that z-axis, that's also, it's a dolly shot because it sits on a dolly. And then you can have crane shot. The crane shot sits literally on a crane, and it rises. So you have all of these things. Understand the various ways that a camera moves. And really, when you stop and think about it, anybody that really understands movies and anybody that really gets involved in movies, especially I think when you deal with classical Hollywood, because it really took the effort to move a camera. Okay, it wasn't easy. So there was a purpose behind that movement. Why did the camera move? What does it mean from a static shot to suddenly move? All right, we don't see that today. Today, they just move the camera all the time. And you don't have to really worry about it. It's kind of a gimmicky kind of a thing. But back with classical Hollywood, you wonder, okay, why did the director make that decision to move the camera? Lighting, different types and effects of lighting, understand the three-point lighting. That's where it all begins. Also sound, how mics work, mixing, scoring, continuity. Understand the difference between a shot and a scene. And the important thing to remember is that a shot simply is turning the camera on. That's all it does. You turn it on, you turn it off. A scene, the key word there with a scene, to understand what a scene is dramatic. It is the first dramatic unit that is involved. The shot, turn it on, turn it off. The scene, a dramatic unit of film. Scene editing, between and within scenes. Today, it's all practically jump cuts. Very few do you ever see anything involving dissolves, wipes, those kinds of things, unless, of course, if you're Star Wars. And Star Wars was a throwback. They used a lot of wipes. They used a lot of those kinds of transitions between scenes, because Lucas was trying to say, I'm a throwback back to the old days of Hollywood. But in the classic Hollywood style, what is the difference between a fade, when you fade out, fade to black, versus a dissolve, which they used to call a lap dissolve because it overlaps. Okay. Also, scene organization, linear, circular, flashback, how it works. Cross-cutting. Remember that cross-cutting is something that you guys, all of us, understand because we've been to the movies enough and we understand what's happening. But in the beginning, cross-cutting would have been something, because a cut, back in the early days of filmmaking, a cut meant there was some kind of passage in time. But with cross-cutting, what it was it was simultaneous time. You could cut, as I think I mentioned this before, but maybe not, during our orientation. But let's go back to the old silent movie, and you have the villain who has tied the woman to the railroad track, and you have the train that's coming down the track, you have the villain running away, and you have the hero on the horse running to rescue the woman on the railroad track. Now, when we put that all together, we have all of these kind of disparate things that are happening. The train coming, the hero coming, the villain leaving, the woman screaming. Okay? But we cut among those things, and we realize that it's all simultaneous action, that it hasn't moved in time. We have just stopped, and we have looked, and we see the train coming, and we see the guy on the horse, and they're happening at the same time. So that's how cross-cutting came about. Point of view editing, that's basically, Hollywood editing. It's basically, you cut to a shot, the long shot, that introduces the scene. Then you cut into a medium shot. Then you go to close-ups. Then you go to the medium shot again, and all of this kind of stuff that happens within that frame and within that scene to indicate all of those things. Okay, moving on. The studio system. Again, the Patents Company, the key players in the creation of early studio system know the names Fox, Laemmle, Mayer, Goldwyn, Lowe. Understand that it's an oligopoly. Have a good understanding of these other things on how the business works. Blind booking and block booking. Runs, zones, and clearances. Recognize that in 1915, the actual Supreme Court ruled that movies were not art, movies were business. And so they ruled it as a trust and broke up the Motion Picture Patents Company. The 5 major studios, know that they are Paramount, MGM, Fox, Warner Brothers, and RKO Radio Pictures, and they are supplemented pretty much by 3 minors, Universal, Columbia, and United Artists. The low-budget filmmakers that are called Poverty Row, there's a whole list of them there. Republic and Monogram, Grand National, PRC, Eagle Eye and Allied Artists, American International. And then the Department of Justice Paramount case in 1958, which broke up that oligopoly. It broke it up so they no longer have control of all three of those things: production, distribution, and exhibition. And the effect of the breakup on current film production, what that means is today what they have is that studios are usually banks. They just give you money to make film, independent films. The average cost of film production over time, rise of artisans, independent film producers, and so forth. Then we have to move into the star. Not much to say about him other than the important thing is that stars have masks or personas and created by film studios. That's pretty much what they were all about. And the last part you should understand is that since the breakup of the studio system, stars make it via other media. That is music and television. Genre. The important thing on all genres is to know that it stabilizes an otherwise unstable movie industry. And it does it through familiarity. What it does is that each new film banks on a number of familiar elements, motifs, and themes, but in a new way. In other words, we all know what a Western looks like. We'll all go see Western movies. As we see the Westerns, we still like them, even though they're telling us the same story. But they do it in new and different ways. Okay, and speaking of that, we can say that the Western is distinctly American. We can say the three ingredients of the hero, the villain, the landscape. It's the symbolism is pretty much right there. It's East meets West, and it's kind of the culture conflicts that go on. And we can say that Westerns are still made as space films. They are the final frontier because space films are usually look just like Westerns. The American comedy. Comedy is usually expressed in this by social repression. In the early films, they talked about the themes in racism, social integration, the cosmic disintegration or comic disintegration and disorder, and all of that. The funny thing, in early comedies, sound comedies in the 1930s in particular, it was always destroying high society. The popular comedy actors. Know that in the silent era that slapstick was king, and why not? There wasn't much you could do except show a lot of things, and that was expressed by Chaplin and Keaton. In the early sound era, however, it becomes verbal wit. Not just simply telling jokes, but it's a verbal wit, the way that they handle the things, the way they handled sound, and best expressed by Laurel and Hardy and the Marx Brothers. The screwball comedy is a hybrid of romantic and the slapstick. All right. Comedies that followed screwball, these are thesis comedies, the dark comedy. We're bringing it all the way up to modern times. The raunchy comedy and also the family style comedy. Okay, that pretty much summarizes what's going to be on the exam. And if you are confused and bewildered and rattled and depressed and desperate, well, so am I. But I can still help you out somehow by stop by during office hours or send an email. I'll be in my office tomorrow morning. Remember that the study guide is available on Moodle. That should help you as well. So once you download that, once you take a look at that, and if you can say, yes, I know all of this kind of stuff, I'm in good shape, but I don't know what that is, and you still need some help, send an email, and then we can clarify that for you. Like I say, it's on Moodle, it's on the web, and there'll be no makeup exams, and you are responsible, and that's it, the end. We made it. Good luck. That's all. Bye.